Hey everyone, tonight I want to start with something that's probably hanging in your closet right now. Something so ordinary, so basic, that you've never thought twice about putting it on. But here's the thing, if you had been born a woman just a century ago in most of the world, that simple act could have gotten you arrested, beaten, divorced, declared insane and locked away. I'm talking about pants. Trousers, whatever you call them where you are. Tonight we're diving into one of history's most absurd yet terrifying examples of how societies control women's bodies and what happened to the brave, stubborn, or simply practical women who dared to cover their legs with fabric that covered their legs with fabric. Grab something warm to drink if you want, maybe dim the lights a bit. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our little community spread across time zones. And hey, if you end up enjoying this deep dive into the absolutely wild ways humans have policed clothing, maybe hit that like button. But only if you genuinely want to, and not your mom, because what we're about to explore together isn't just about fashion. It's about power, control, and the lengths societies will go to keep women in their place. And trust me, the consequences were far darker than you might imagine. So let's step back in time together and see what happened when women dared to put on pants. So let's go back, way back. You're waking up in ancient Rome around 200 CE. The empire is vast, powerful, supposedly civilized. You're in your villa, and you have what seems like a simple choice to make about what to wear. Now you've heard rumors about women in the far northern territories, barbarian women who wear something called bracy, these strange leg-covering garments that the Germanic and Celtic tribes favor. But you're Roman, you're civilized. You wear a stola, a long flowing dress that marks you as a proper woman of status. Because in Rome, pants aren't just foreign, they're fundamentally un-Roman. They're what barbarians wear. What men wear when they're trying to be barbarians. The Romans had this fascinating anxiety about pants that went way deeper than fashion. To them, the toga and stola weren't just clothes, they were symbols of civilization itself. Pants represented everything Rome wasn't: wild, uncivilized, feminine in wrong way, masculine in the wrong way. It's almost like they couldn't figure out what pants meant gender-wise, so they just decided they meant chaos. But here's where it gets interesting. Some Roman women did wear pants, sort of. Archaeological evidence shows us that women in colder provinces, especially along the northern borders, sometimes wore leg coverings under their dresses. But these weren't pants as we'd recognize them. They were more like really tight leggings, and they were always hidden, always shameful, always a concession to practicality that had to be covered up by proper feminine clothing. The consequences for stepping outside. These norms weren't necessarily legal. Rome was actually pretty pragmatic about a lot of things. But they were social. A woman wearing visible pants would be marked as foreign, uncivilized, not really Roman. And in an empire where citizenship was everything, that was no small thing. Movies to ancient Persia, and the story gets even more complex. Persian women, particularly noble women, sometimes wore trouser-like garments called shalwar. But these weren't symbols of rebellion or practicality. They were actually symbols of wealth and status because they required so much fabric and such skilled tailoring. The flowing, elaborate pants of Persian nobility were as much about displaying wealth as any Roman stola. But here's the catch: even in Persia, where pants were acceptable for women, they came with rules. Strict rules about cut, fabric, ornamentation. A woman couldn't just throw on any old trousers. The garments had to signal her status, her family's position, her husband's wealth. They were still a form of control, just control wrapped in silk, instead of prohibition. The ancient Chinese had their own complicated relationship with women's leg coverings. During certain dynasties, particularly among the upper classes, women wore elaborate trouser-like garments under their robes. But again, hidden. These weren't standalone garments. They were undergarments, basically ancient shapewear that created the proper silhouette under the real clothing. What's fascinating is how consistent this pattern is across cultures that had no contact with each other. Whether it's Rome, Persia, China, or the Celtic territories, there's this universal anxiety about women's legs and who gets to see them, how they're covered, what kind of covering is appropriate. It's like human societies independently invented the same fears about women's bodies and autonomy, and the consequences for getting it wrong. They varied, but they were always there. Social ostracism was universal. Economic consequences, being unmarriageable, losing access to certain social circles, were common. Violence was always lurking in the background, though it might be disguised as family honor or social correction. But here's what really gets me about this ancient period: the sheer arbitrariness of it all. Why should a piece of fabric sewn with a seam in the middle be more threatening than a piece of fabric without a seam? Why should covering your legs completely be more scandalous than leaving them partially exposed under a dress? The answer, of course, is that it was never really about the pants. It was about women making choices, about women prioritizing their own comfort, mobility, or practical needs over society's need to control and categorize them. A woman in pants was a woman who had decided that her own needs mattered more than other people's expectations of her body. And that was genuinely threatening to social orders built on women's compliance. Because think about it. If women could decide what to wear based on what was practical or comfortable for them, what else might they decide for themselves? Where they went, what work they did, who they married. Whether they married at all, the pants were never really the problem. They were just an easy symbol to police, a visible way to enforce invisible boundaries. And as we'll see, that pattern, using clothing to control women's broader autonomy, was just getting started. Jump forward to medieval Europe, around 1200 CE, and things have gotten intense. You're living in a world where the church has opinions about literally everything you put on your body, and those opinions come with the weight of eternal damnation behind them. Picture yourself as a woman in medieval France. You wake up and you're thinking about maybe, just maybe, wearing those practical leg coverings you've seen men use for writing and working. But here's the thing. The church has decided that women wearing men's clothing is literally a sin against God. Not just socially inappropriate, not just unfashionable, actually sinful. Like, risk your immortal soul sinful. The medieval world was obsessed with biblical passages about clothing, particularly Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. And medieval scholars, they had thoughts about this. Detailed, elaborate, sometimes frankly unhinged thoughts about what it meant for gender, for society, for the natural order of creation. Thomas Aquinas, that guy who basically built the philosophical foundation of medieval Christianity, wrote extensively about clothing and gender. He argued that women wearing men's clothing was wrong not just because the Bible said so, but because it violated the natural hierarchy that God had established. Women were supposed to be subordinate, and wearing masculine clothing was a rejection of that subordination. It was, quite literally, rebelling against God's plan for creation. But here's where medieval life gets complicated. Because while the church was laying down these absolute rules, actual medieval people were living actual medieval lives. And medieval life was hard, dirty, physical work for most people, regardless of gender. So you've got these fascinating cases of women who wore men's clothing for practical reasons and ended up in serious trouble. Joan of Arc is the famous one, but she wasn't unique. There are records of women hauled before church courts for wearing men's clothing while working in fields, while traveling, while doing any number of things that required nobility and protection that women's clothing simply couldn't provide. The consequences were no joke. Excommunication was on the table. Public penance. Think standing outside the church for weeks, being publicly shamed by your entire community. Fines that could bankrupt a family. And sometimes, if you were really unlucky or really persistent, accusations of witchcraft. Because here's the thing about medieval logic: if you were a woman rejecting God's plan for your gender by wearing men's clothing, well, who else might be influencing you to reject divine authority? Obviously the devil. This wasn't paranoia. This was how educated medieval people actually thought about gender. Transgression. Joan of Arc's trial records are absolutely wild to read. The English and French authorities prosecuting her spent an enormous amount of time on her clothing choices. Not just the fact that she wore men's clothing, but the details, the cut of her hair, the style of her boots, the fact that she refused to wear women's clothing, even in prison. They genuinely believed that her masculine clothing was evidence of her communication with demons, but Joan wasn't the only one. There are scattered records throughout medieval Europe of women who wore men's clothing for practical reasons. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, women working in trades, and faced serious consequences. Sometimes they were forced to do public penance. Sometimes they were fined. Sometimes they were physically attacked by neighbors who saw their clothing as a threat to community moral standards. The really fascinating cases are the ones where women wore men's clothing to access opportunities that were otherwise closed. To them, there are records of women who dressed as men to join monasteries, to attend universities, to practice medicine. When they were discovered, and they usually were eventually, the consequences were severe. Not just expulsion, but often public humiliation designed to make an example of them. What's particularly cruel about medieval enforcement of these clothing rules is how they trapped women in impossible situations. Women needed to travel? Well, traveling in women's clothing was dangerous and impractical, but traveling in men's clothing was sinful and illegal. Women needed to do physical work? Same problem. Women wanted education or religious life. Again, impossible in women's clothing. Forbidden in men's. And the medieval world was absolutely convinced that this made sense. They had elaborate theological justifications for why women's clothing had to be impractical, restrictive, and often dangerous. It wasn't just tradition, it was divine command. Women who challenged these norms weren't just being difficult. They were challenging the fundamental order of creation. But some women did it anyway. And we know they did because of the records of their punishments. Every trial record, every fine, every forced penance is evidence that women kept trying to make practical choices about their bodies and their lives, even when the consequences were severe. What strikes me about this period is how the stakes got so much higher than they were in the ancient world. Ancient societies might socially ostracize women who wore the wrong clothes, but medieval Europe made it a matter of eternal salvation. They turned practical clothing choices into theological crises, and this escalation wasn't an accident. It was a feature of a social system that needed women to be visibly, constantly subordinate. Because if women could dress practically, comfortably, safely, what else might they do? The pants were still never really about the pants. They were about control. And in medieval Europe, that control had the full weight of heaven and hell behind it. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and you might think things would get better. After all, This is the age of humanism, of individual expression, of questioning old authorities. Surely this would be when women finally got to wear practical clothing without risking their lives, right? Well, not exactly. Picture yourself as a woman in 16th century London. Shakespeare is writing plays, the world is opening up, ideas are flowing. But if you, as a woman, decide to put on a pair of men's breeches, even just to, say, work in your garden or travel safely, you could find yourself in the stocks. Literally. Public humiliation. Rotten vegetables thrown at you. The whole community watching you be punished for your clothing choices. Because Renaissance, Europe didn't abandon medieval anxieties about women's clothing. It intensified them. The Protestant Reformation had made everyone even more conscious of biblical law, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation wasn't about to be outdone in moral strictness. Both sides agreed. Women in men's clothing were a problem that needed solving. But here's where it gets really interesting. Renaissance theater created this fascinating loophole. Boy actors played women's roles, which everyone accepted as normal. But occasionally, plots required these boy actors playing women to disguise themselves as men. So you'd have a boy playing a woman dressed as a man. And audiences loved it. They thought it was hilarious and clever and delightful. But let a real woman put on the exact same costume outside the theater? Scandal, possible legal consequences, social ostracism. The same clothing that was entertaining on stage was threatening. In real life, because in real life, it represented a real woman making a real choice about her real body. Some women did it anyway, and we have records of their punishments. In 1620, a pamphlet called Hic Mulier was published in London, basically a moral panic about women wearing men's clothing. It describes women who wore doublets with pendant codpieces on the breast, full of jags and cuts and sleeves of sundry colors. The author was absolutely horrified that women were not just wearing men's clothing, but wearing fashionable, expensive, stylish men's clothing. What terrified the pamphlet writer wasn't that women were trying to be practical, it was that they were trying to be fashionable. They weren't wearing men's clothing out of necessity. They were wearing it because they liked how it looked, how it felt, how it made them move through the world. They were making aesthetic choices about their own bodies, and that was apparently terrifying. The legal consequences were real. English law during this period had various statutes that could be used to prosecute women for wearing men's clothing. Vagrancy laws, sumptuary laws, which regulated who could wear what based on social class, and moral laws could all be applied. Women could be fined, imprisoned, or subjected to public punishment, but the social consequences were often worse than the legal ones. A woman known for wearing men's clothing could become unmarriageable. She could lose access to guilds, to trade associations, to the social networks that made survival possible in early modern Europe. Her family could be shamed. Her children could face discrimination, and yet some women persisted. There are records of women who dressed as men to serve in armies, to travel as merchants, to access education. When they were discovered, the consequences were severe. But they kept doing it, which suggests that for some women, the benefits of mobility and freedom were worth the enormous risks. One of the most fascinating cases from this period is Catalina de Hereso, a Spanish woman who escaped from a convent, dressed as a man, and spent years as a soldier in South America. When her biological sex was discovered, she was returned to Spain to face the Inquisition. But here's the wild part. The King of Spain was so impressed by her military service that he granted her a pension and permission to continue wearing men's clothing. The Pope gave her special dispensation to dress as a man for the rest of her life. But Catalina's case was exceptional, precisely because it was so rare. Most women who wore men's clothing faced punishment, not royal pensions. The fact that her case was considered so remarkable tells us how unusual it was for authorities to approve of women's clothing choices, even when those choices led to remarkable achievements. What's particularly cruel about this period is how the Renaissance, emphasis on individual expression and achievement, applied to everyone except women. Men were encouraged to develop their talents, express their personalities, pursue their ambitions. But women who tried to do the same by wearing clothing that allowed them mobility and freedom were still seen as threats to social order. The art of the period reflects this anxiety. Paintings and prints often depicted women in men's clothing as figures of chaos, disorder, sexual deviance. The visual message was clear: women who dressed like men were dangerous to society itself. But here's what I find hopeful about this period. Despite all the legal, social, and religious pressure against it, women kept wearing men's clothing. They found ways to work around the rules, to justify their choices, to minimize the consequences. Some women wore men's clothing underneath women's clothing. Some wore modified versions that weren't quite men's clothing, but weren't quite women's clothing either. Some simply accepted the consequences and wore what they wanted anyway. The Renaissance didn't liberate women from clothing restrictions. If anything, it made those restrictions more elaborate and more strictly enforced. But it also created more opportunities for women to see what they were missing, to imagine different ways of living in their bodies. And some of them decided the risks were worth it. Now we're getting to the 18th and early 19th centuries, and something interesting is happening. Revolution is in the air. The American Revolution, the French Revolution. Ideas about individual rights and equality are spreading. But when it comes to women wearing pants, the backlash gets even more intense. Let's put you in Paris. 1793. The French Revolution is in full swing. The Declaration of the Rights of Man has been proclaimed. Liberty, equality, fraternity are the watchwords. But if you're a woman and you decide to wear trousers, practical, comfortable trousers that would let you participate more fully in this brave new world of equality, you could be arrested under laws that specifically prohibited women from wearing men's clothing. Here's the absolutely wild part. Revolutionary France, which was supposedly overthrowing all the old hierarchies and prejudices, kept and enforced medieval laws about women's clothing. In 1800, Napoleon's government issued a law requiring women to get police permission before wearing men's clothing in Paris. Police permission to wear pants. In the supposed Age of Enlightenment. And the French weren't alone. Across Europe and in the new American Republic, women's clothing was becoming more regulated, not less. The paradox of the Age of Revolution was that while it expanded freedoms for men, it often explicitly restricted freedoms for women, as if granting political rights to men required even tighter control over women's bodies and choices. But some women weren't having it. Enter George Sand, Amantini Lucille Horry Duping, one of the most famous women of 19th century France. She was a novelist, a feminist, a woman who lived openly with multiple lovers and wrote under a man's name. And she wore men's clothing. Not secretly, not apologetically, but openly and defiantly. Sand had to apply for police permission to wear men's clothing, which she did, citing health reasons. The authorities granted it reluctantly, and she became one of the most visible women in men's clothing in 19th century Europe. The reaction was intense. Critics called her everything from unnatural to depraved to a threat to social order. But she kept wearing trousers, and more importantly, she wrote about why she did it. In her autobiography, Sand described the incredible freedom of movement that men's clothing gave her. She could walk faster, climb stairs more easily, navigate crowded streets without constantly worrying about her skirts. She could go places and do things that women's clothing made difficult or impossible. The practical difference was enormous, but the social cost was also enormous. Sand was wealthy and famous enough to absorb some of the criticism, but even she faced constant attacks on her femininity, her morality, her fitness to be a mother. Newspapers regularly caricatured her as a monster, a freak, a warning about what happened when women rejected their proper roles. Across the Atlantic, American women were dealing with similar restrictions, but the enforcement was often more social than legal. In the 1850s, women's rights activist Amelia Bloomer popularized what became known as bloomers, a revolutionary outfit consisting of a shorter skirt worn over loose trousers. The idea was to give women more mobility while still maintaining some semblance of feminine dress. The reaction was swift and vicious. Women who wore bloomers were refused service in restaurants and hotels. They were banned from public transportation. They faced harassment on the streets. Ministers preached sermons against them. Newspapers ran editorial campaigns, denouncing them as threats to family and society. What's fascinating about the bloomer controversy is how it revealed the real anxieties underneath the clothing restrictions. Critics weren't worried about the practical aspects of women wearing trousers. They were worried about what that mobility might lead to. Women who could move freely might go places they weren't supposed to go. They might do things they weren't supposed to do. They might start thinking they had the same rights as men. Dr. Mary Walker took these anxieties and ran with them. She was a Civil War surgeon who wore men's clothing throughout her career, arguing that women's clothing was not only impractical for medical work, but actually dangerous to her patients. She was arrested multiple times for her clothing choices, but she always refused to pay fines or change her dress. Walker's case is particularly interesting because she was doing work that everyone agreed was valuable and necessary. She was saving lives, serving her country, using her education and skills for the public good. But even that wasn't enough to excuse her clothing choices in the eyes of authorities. They would rather have a less effective doctor who wore appropriate clothing than a more effective one who didn't. The consequences for ordinary women who tried to wear practical clothing were often severe. Working-class women who wore men's clothing for their jobs faced arrest, fines, job loss. Women who wore men's clothing for travel faced harassment, assault, legal troubles. The message was clear. Women's comfort, safety, and practical needs were less important than maintaining visible gender distinctions. But here's what's remarkable about this period. Despite all the legal and social pressure, more and more women were pushing back. The women's rights movement was growing, and clothing freedom was becoming explicitly connected to other forms of freedom. Women's rights activists argued that if women couldn't even choose their own clothing, how could they be expected to have political rights? The connection wasn't lost on opponents either. Anti-feminist writers regularly pointed to women's clothing choices as evidence that women's rights would lead to the breakdown of civilization. If women could wear pants, they argued, what would stop them from demanding the vote? Property rights? Educational opportunities? The slippery slope from trousers to equality was a real fear for many people. What strikes me about this revolutionary period is how it laid bare the political nature of clothing restrictions. When societies were explicitly questioning authority and hierarchy, women's clothing became a battleground for larger questions about power and control. The fact that revolutionary governments kept medieval clothing laws for women shows just how threatening the idea of women's autonomy really was. But it also shows how persistent women were in pushing for practical freedoms. Every arrest record, every newspaper attack, Every social scandal was evidence that women kept trying to dress in ways that made their lives easier, safer, more comfortable. They kept pushing against restrictions, even when the consequences were severe. The age of revolution didn't revolutionize women's clothing rights. If anything, it made the stakes higher and the resistance more organized. But it also made the political nature of clothing restrictions more visible, and that visibility would prove crucial in the battles to come. Welcome to the Victorian era, where industrial progress is transforming everything about how people live and work. But women's clothing is somehow getting more restrictive than ever. You're living in an age of steam engines and telegraphs and railway networks. But if you're a woman who wants to wear practical clothing to navigate this new world, well, good luck with that. Picture yourself as a woman in 1850s London. The city is booming. Factories are running. Opportunities for work and education are expanding. But you're expected to navigate this dynamic, dangerous, fast-paced urban environment while wearing a corset that restricts your breathing. Multiple layers of petticoats and a skirt so wide you can barely fit through doorways. And if you suggest that maybe, just maybe, you'd like to wear something more practical, you're threatening the very foundations of civilization. The Victorians had turned women's restrictive clothing into a science. They had elaborate theories about how tight lacing was good for women's moral character, how heavy skirts prevented women from moving too quickly and becoming overexcited, how complicated clothing kept women properly occupied with feminine concerns. It wasn't enough anymore to just forbid women from wearing men's clothing. Women's clothing had to be actively impractical, actively restrictive. But here's the thing about the Victorian era. It was also producing women who had new reasons to challenge these restrictions. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They were becoming doctors, teachers, factory workers, office clerks. They were riding bicycles, playing sports, attending universities. And all of these activities were basically impossible in standard women's clothing. So, you get these fascinating compromises and workarounds. The rational dress movement gained momentum in the 1880s, promoting clothing that was revolutionary. Concept, designed for the activities women actually needed to do. They advocated for shorter skirts, fewer layers, less restrictive corsets. Not men's clothing exactly, but clothing that acknowledged that women had bodies that needed to move and work. The response was immediate and harsh. The medical establishment, dominated by men, obviously produced studies proving that rational dress was harmful to women's health and reproductive capacity. Fashion magazines mocked women who wore practical clothing. Society matrons organized campaigns against it. The message was clear. Women who prioritized their own comfort and mobility over society's aesthetic preferences were selfish, unfeminine, and potentially dangerous. Dr. Mary Walker, who we met earlier, was still fighting her clothing battles. In the 1870s and 80s, she was still being arrested for wearing men's clothing, still refusing to pay fines, still arguing that practical clothing was necessary for her work as a physician. But now she had company. Other professional women were pushing against clothing restrictions, arguing that their careers required practical dress. The bicycle craze of the 1890s created a particular crisis. Suddenly, middle-class women had a reason to want practical clothing. That wasn't connected to work or politics. It was connected to a fun, popular activity that their husbands and fathers might also enjoy. But riding a bicycle in a corset and long skirt was basically impossible. So women started wearing bicycle costumes, shorter skirts, sometimes with divided skirts that were essentially very wide pants. The moral panic was immediate. Critics argued that bicycle riding in practical clothing was unwomanly, that it would damage women's reproductive organs, that it would make women too independent and too mobile. There were actual campaigns against women's bicycle riding, with doctors and ministers and politicians all weighing in on the moral dangers of women moving freely through space. But women kept riding bicycles, and they kept wearing practical clothing to do it. And gradually, the sky didn't fall, society didn't collapse. Women who rode bicycles in rational dress still got married, still had children, still participated in community life. The practical benefits of mobility started to outweigh the theoretical dangers. Meanwhile, working-class women were facing different but related challenges. Women working in factories, in offices, in shops needed clothing that let them do their jobs safely and efficiently. But they also needed clothing that marked them as respectable women, not as gender transgressors. So you get the evolution of working women's clothing: practical but clearly feminine, efficient but not threatening. The department store boom of the late Victorian era created new pressures and new opportunities. On one hand, ready-made clothing made it easier for women to access a wider variety of clothing styles. On the other hand, department stores had a vested interest in maintaining clothing traditions that required women to buy lots of complicated, expensive garments. What's particularly striking about this period is how the arguments against practical women's clothing evolved. Earlier eras had focused on religious or moral objections. Victorian critics increasingly made medical and scientific arguments. They claimed that practical clothing was harmful to women's health, that it interfered with women's natural biological functions, that it would damage women's capacity for motherhood. These medical arguments had real power because they seemed objective and scientific, but of course they weren't. They were the same old anxieties about women's autonomy, dressed up in the voyeur language of modern medicine. The real fear wasn't that practical clothing would hurt women's bodies. It was that practical clothing would free women's bodies to do things that challenged male authority. Victorian women kept pushing. They formed organizations advocating for dress reform. They wrote articles and gave lectures about the health benefits of practical clothing. They created alternative fashion magazines promoting rational dress. They organized exhibitions of practical clothing for working women. And slowly, very slowly, some progress was made. By the end of the Victorian era, women's clothing was still restrictive by our standards, but it was less restrictive than it had been 50 years earlier. Women had won the right to slightly shorter skirts, slightly less restrictive corsets, clothing designed for specific activities like sports or cycling. The Victorian era didn't solve the problem of women's clothing restrictions, but it did establish the principle that women's practical needs were legitimate considerations in clothing design. That principle would prove crucial in the battles of the 20th century. And then came the 20th century, and everything accelerated. 2 world wars, women entering the workforce en masse, social movements, technological changes that transformed daily life. Surely this would be when women finally definitively won the right to wear pants without consequences, right? Well, it took longer than you might think. Let's start with World War I. Suddenly, women were needed to do men's jobs while men were fighting. Women worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, served as mechanics, took on physically demanding work that required practical clothing. And for the first time in history, there was widespread social acceptance of women wearing pants, as long as it was for the war effort. But here's the catch: it was temporary acceptance. The understanding was that women would wear practical clothing during the emergency, then return to proper feminine dress once the crisis was over. Women's practical clothing needs were acknowledged, but only in the context of serving others, not in the context of their own autonomy. When the war ended, There was enormous social pressure for women to return to restrictive clothing as proof that they were returning to traditional feminine roles. Women who kept wearing practical clothing after the war were seen as refusing to give up their inappropriate wartime freedoms. The message was clear. Practical clothing was acceptable only when society needed women to be practical, not when women themselves wanted to be practical. The 1920s brought the flapper revolution, shorter skirts, looser clothing, a rejection of Victorian restrictiveness. But even the revolutionary flappers weren't wearing pants. They were wearing more practical dresses, but they were still wearing dresses. The line between practical feminine clothing and masculine clothing was still being carefully maintained. But some women were crossing that line. Coco Chanel began designing trouser suits for women in the 1920s, arguing that women deserved clothing that was both elegant and practical. Marlene Dietrich famously wore men's suits both on screen and in her personal life, creating a sensation and inspiring both admiration and outrage. The reaction to women like Dietrich revealed how high the stakes still were. She faced constant criticism, both personal attacks on her femininity and professional consequences for her clothing choices. But she also inspired other women to experiment with more androgynous styles, creating a small but visible movement of women who refused to be restricted by traditional gender norms in their clothing choices. World War II accelerated these changes dramatically. Once again, women were needed in traditionally male roles, and once again, practical clothing became socially acceptable out of necessity. But this time, the changes went deeper. Rosie the Riveter in her practical work clothes became an icon of American womanhood, not an exception to it. The famous "We Can Do It" poster showed a woman in work clothes, practical, efficient, powerful clothing that enabled her to do important work. For the first time, women's practical clothing was being celebrated as patriotic and admirable, not just tolerated as a temporary necessity. But even during World War II, the acceptance of women's practical clothing came with limits. Women could wear pants at work, but they were still expected to wear dresses for social occasions, for shopping, for any activity that wasn't directly related to the war effort. The spheres of acceptable pants wearing were carefully defined and policed. After the war, there was again pressure for women to return to traditional feminine clothing. The 1950s ideal of the suburban housewife specifically emphasized traditionally feminine dress, full skirts, fitted bodices, impractical but pretty clothing that signaled that women were no longer needed for practical work. But something had changed. Women who had worn practical clothing during the war knew what they were giving up. They had experienced the freedom of movement, the comfort, the efficiency of clothing designed for real life rather than for display, and many of them weren't willing to give that up entirely. The result was a kind of compromise fashion, clothing that was more practical than Victorian dress, but still clearly feminine. Casual wear became more acceptable for women, including pants for certain activities. But there were still strict rules about when and where women could wear pants. Into the 1960s and 70s, most restaurants, offices, schools, and other institutions still had dress codes that required women to wear dresses or skirts. Women could wear pants at home, for casual activities, for certain types of work, but not for formal occasions, professional settings, or social events. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s made women's clothing choices explicitly political. Activists argued that restrictive clothing was a symbol of women's broader oppression, that the freedom to dress practically was connected to other freedoms, economic, political, social. The response was predictably intense. Critics of the women's movement regularly pointed to changing clothing norms as evidence that feminism would destroy traditional families and social structures. The same old anxieties about women's autonomy now focused on the symbolism of women. Wearing pants in previously forbidden contexts, but the momentum was building. By the 1980s, women's pantsuits were becoming acceptable professional wear. By the 1990s, pants were widely accepted for women in most contexts. And by the 2000s, the idea that women shouldn't wear pants seemed quaint and old-fashioned to most people. But even today, the story isn't over. There are still dress codes that restrict women's clothing choices. There are still social pressures that push women toward impractical but feminine clothing. There are still consequences for women who dress in ways that challenge gender norms. The 20th century brought enormous changes in women's clothing freedom, but it also showed how persistent these restrictions are, how they evolve and adapt rather than simply disappearing. The battle for women's right to wear practical clothing wasn't won once and for all. It had to be fought over and over again, in different contexts, against different forms of resistance. So here we are, back in your closet, looking at those pants that seemed so ordinary when we started this journey. But now you know the stories hidden in that simple piece of clothing. You know about the women who were arrested for wearing fabric with a seam down the middle. The women who were declared insane, divorced, excommunicated, beaten, mocked, and ostracized for making the simple choice to cover their legs in a way that let them move freely through the world. That you know about Joan of Arc, tried for heresy partly because she refused to wear a dress. About George Sand, applying to the police for permission to wear trousers in revolutionary Paris. About Dr. Mary Walker, repeatedly arrested for wearing practical clothing to do her medical work. About countless unnamed women who faced consequences we can barely imagine for choices we make without thinking. And here's what gets me. This isn't ancient history. This isn't a quaint story about how backward people used to be. Women are still facing consequences for their clothing choices today. Still being told their clothing is too revealing, too masculine, too something. Still having their autonomy questioned based on what they put on their bodies. The pants were never really about the pants. They were about power, control, and the length societies will go to keep women in their assigned places. Every time a woman put on practical clothing despite the consequences, she was asserting that her comfort, her safety, her ability to move freely through the world mattered more than other people's need to control her. Tonight, when you get dressed tomorrow, remember them. Remember the courage it took. Remember that the freedoms we take for granted were fought for inch by inch by women who decided their own needs mattered. Thanks for taking this journey with me. Sleep well, and wear whatever makes you feel free.